Our first presenter is Ingrid Jaradat, who will discuss Palestinian identity and Palestinians as a distinct racial group for the purposes of the definition of apartheid. I would like to remind all of our witnesses that they are to summarize their provided testimony, and because of our time constraints. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Dear Tribunal, dear jury, I would like to say just at the beginning that I submit this testimony on behalf of the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions National Committee, which is probably the currently largest, broadest coalition of Palestinian civil society, including refugees in exile, those under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and Palestinian citizens discriminated inside Israel. I also wanted to use this opportunity to say again how grateful we are for this forum that has taken on the discussion about whether apartheid applies to our situation, because, as was said here before, the voices that have tried to do so in the past have been silenced so many times. And we are usually denied a forum for raising these issues. And I would just like to submit one little piece of evidence of forum denied to the jury, because we prepared in 2008 our own study about how we see apartheid applying to the situation of the Palestinian people for the Durban Review Conference that was held in Geneva in 2009, and we were not allowed to speak. So I would like to submit a copy of this small report to the jury here as part of your documentation. Now, as to the question whether Palestinians are a racial group for the purpose of the definition of apartheid, it is our understanding that yes, Palestinians can be so defined, although it is important to say that Palestinians don't usually define themselves as a race or a racial group or an ethnic group, because there is a very strong sense that this is part of the tools of the oppressor, that people are categorized and classified and subdivided into different groups. So, but at the same time, all Palestinians agree that they suffer from racial discrimination as a group and as a people that continues to claim the right to their country. So in the broad sense of the definition of provided under third, we understand that we can define Palestinians as a racial group for this particular purpose. Specifically, why? Because, for example, Palestinians identify themselves as the indigenous population of the country of Palestine, and a country where they were citizens under the British mandate regime, basically until 1948. Palestinians all have lived through the experience of massive forced displacement from the Nakba in 1948, basically ongoing until today. And Palestinians see themselves as victims of this of a racist colonial regime that displaced them, which is the regime of previously the Zionist movement, today the Zionist state of Israel. And thirdly, because Palestinians define themselves as one people, no matter where they currently live, including the refugees, those in the 67 occupied Palestinian territory and the citizens of Israel. They are one people and who have the right to return and self-determination, and who are represented. They have one legitimate representative, the PLO, and they have been recognized as such by the United Nations. So if we combine these elements of identity and origin and connectedness, it is our understanding that we can define the Palestinian people as a racial group, and we say the entire Palestinian people constitutes the racial group of the oppressed for the purpose of the definition of apartheid, meaning that it is not only the Palestinians in the 67 occupied territory that are the oppressed group, it is the entire people that is the victim of the oppressing racial group, which we define not just as Jewish Israelis, meaning that they are Jewish citizens of Israel, but we also say they are Jewish citizens of Israel who identify themselves as Jewish nationals under Zionist Israeli law and endorse the ideology of Zionism. So we say the group of the racial group of the oppressor are Zionist Jewish Israelis. And we think this is important for many reasons, because not all the Jewish people can be part of the racial group of the oppressor, and even not all Jewish Israelis are part of the racial group of the oppressor, but there has to be an endorsement of the purpose, because apartheid is a racist regime with a purpose. So we say there has to be an endorsement of the purpose of oppression, and that purpose is expressed in the identification with Zionism. So maybe just to summarize, maybe a few things very briefly in addition to this argument why the Palestinian people should be defined as a racial group. We see that there are a few features of Israeli apartheid that emerge from this approach. One is that, which seems to be often forgotten, that in fact the Palestinian refugees who are now today in exile, almost half of the people, are in fact the primary victims of this particular system of apartheid. And then we have the two other groups, the discriminated citizens of Israel, and we have those under occupation since '67. The second is the question of the purpose. It is not very popular, we know, to speak about Zionism and to put it back again into the framework of racial discrimination, but I think there is no way around it if we don't want to adopt a racist agenda and a definition by ourselves. Because Zionism is the political program, so there has to be a possibility to speak about Zionism when we speak about an alternative framework that can bring back dignity and equality to all people in the country. And the third point is, there's been so much discussion, I've seen it also in some of the papers here, about whether Israel also exploits Palestinian labor or it doesn't, and how this like affects the definition, and with the question whether apartheid applies, we think that's quite irrelevant, because Israel has just preferred not to exploit the labor, but to take the land and the resources without the people. So that's maybe a different way of treating the oppressed group. And in fact, we believe that since this has been done, this preference has been done in such a systematic manner over, and it's so institutionalized in Israelis' laws and policies, that we think that one should even consider this policy of population transfer as one of the pillars of this particular Israeli apartheid regime. And maybe just one short note that people are maybe not aware, because also in South Africa there was a lot of forced removal and like transfer of people. But there is something special about the Israeli case, because as I said, we have almost half of the people refugees outside. They are not just refugees, they are stateless refugees. They are people who are completely stripped of all legal bond to their country of origin. They cannot claim anything anymore, because Israel has put in place a legal system that strips you of your legal bond to your country. And this, I think, I'm not such an expert in like how it compares to South Africa, but to me it always looks like something that is maybe more special in the case of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. You're right on time. I will assume the presiding officer prerogative of posing the first question. My question actually, I believe, has been answered, but I'd like to reiterate it just for you to reiterate the response. In terms of Palestinian identity, my question was, do Palestinians make a distinction between Palestinians inside Israel, in the occupied territories, or in the diaspora? And I think you responded to that. But I would add further, does the Israeli state make a distinction between those three sets of Palestinians, particularly if they view themselves as one entity?
Well, yes, in terms of Israel, until now, in fact, Palestinians don't really exist as a legal category until now, because if you look at the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, they are not part of the community or the people defined as nationals. They are not Jewish nationals of Israel. You can only be the only nationality that exists in Israel is Jewish nationality. There is no other nationality. So the rest is defined in different subcategories and groups, but there is no Palestinian people in citizens of Israel. Now, in the occupied territories, and since the Oslo Accords, we have some sort of more like symbolic recognition of there being a Palestinian national presence, but in terms of actual law and protection, we heard before, it's like the military orders, there is no Palestinian state or Palestinian citizens or nationals, even in the occupied territories under Israeli law. And for the refugees, they simply don't exist. They are gone. They are disappeared. There is nothing in Israeli law that deals with the refugees. They are wiped from the map.
Would anyone else on the jury have a question for Ingrid?
You talked about you defined the racial group of the oppressor in terms of a specific purpose, and I wonder if you would expand on that.
Well, I think because the definition of apartheid, as we heard also this morning, it is not just about racial discrimination or even systematic racial discrimination or inhuman acts, but there is a purpose to this regime. Oppression is pursued with the purpose of domination. And in our case, we believe that this purpose overall is best expressed in the adherence to the program of political Zionism. And that has been a constant since, from before 48 until today. So that is why we introduced this element in the definition of the racial group of the oppressor.
Our leader, Stefan Hessel, has a question.
Would you be kind enough to tell us how in the Arab community, for instance, in the Arab League, how are Palestinians defined? Do they exist as people, including the refugees and even including the Arabs within Israel, or is there no such general view of who are the Palestinians?
The Arab League has adopted the definition of the PLO, and the PLO defines the Palestinian people the way I just presented to you. Even the United Nations, since 1974, when it recognized Palestinians as a people with the inalienable rights to return and self-determination and sovereignty and all this, including and the PLO as the representative, did give this recognition to the Palestinian people on the same basis as one people, irrespective of where they live.
Ronnie?
Thanks very much. As I understand Zionism from its onset with Herzl in the later part of the 19th century and right through to Ben Gurion and then on to now, the question of non-recognition of Palestinians and regarding them as simply part of an Arab mass, which led the Zionists from the early times right through to say these are people who can simply be, in Herzl's words, spirited out of what was the Palestine Mandate into countries like Jordan, etc. Now we hear all these disturbing new statements of latter-day people. I'll use this term just for sake of brevity, neo-fascist approach of government ministers, foreign minister, deputy prime minister, to remove them totally across the river, Jordan. Now, how does this trend affect, firstly, the people living in the West Bank and the Palestinians living within Israel itself? What is the nature of that threat, of the threat of transfer out of the territories and the country to the west of the Jordan River entirely?
Well, I maybe cannot say so much about the destination of the transfer and what are the perspectives there, because that is very much a matter of like the countries to where there will be this effort to transfer people to, and nowadays the states surrounding Israel have become more aware and are like more observing and monitoring efforts to move people across borders than they were maybe some decades ago. But all this ideology of transfer that has been present all the time, but it comes like in ups and downs, and currently we have a new peaking situation with like the right-wing Israeli governments. So it has an immediate impact on Palestinians in the entire area, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel are permanently confronted with treatment with a treatment that expresses that in fact they are not really citizens. They are kind of like the fifth column in the country. Their status as citizens is doubted, is questioned, and any kind of like political organizing among Palestinians on their own in terms of self-determination, and is immediately used in order to say, you see, in fact, they never really can be citizens of this country. And in the occupied territory, transfer is ongoing all the time. It's maybe one of the problems that we hear a lot about land confiscation, house demolition, but there is usually we forget to ask, so what about the people? You know, like all these violations that we hear about, usually we don't go until the end of the line to ask, so, and what happens to the people? It's just recently, it's interesting, among the UN system in the occupied territory, finally, we have a working group called Forced Displacement Working Group with all of the agencies together, because finally there has been some realization that in fact there is ongoing transfer of people, and unofficially it's become recognized that we have here a policy of forced population transfer, although as we all know then certain things cannot be said and called and named officially in this way, but there is growing recognition of this ongoing population transfer.
Michael?
Yes.
And I would like to caution the jurors as well as the witness that we are out of time.
This is a footnote, hopefully. Dealing with, you call the forced population transfer policy one of the pillars of Israeli apartheid, and you've just talked about the current recognition. Is there a possible way in which you can currently estimate and quantify the numbers involved in terms of refugees or displaced persons?
Well, a global estimate overall, we know that about 70% of the entire Palestinian people has been forcibly displaced at least one point of time. This includes internally displaced people and the refugees outside the borders of the country, but also it includes many of these people were multiply displaced, but forced displacement is like a characteristic of the Palestinian people. You can find hardly anybody in families that has not been forcibly displaced at some point.
Thank you, Ingrid.